Hello everybody, welcome back to the Ietsie Klein channel. I'm Trader, your host. Today is another very balmy day in South Africa, Johannesburg. I'm actually filming this on the Monday, not the Sunday like I usually do, because I spent some time thinking about what I actually want to talk about, which is a bit of a complex topic, but we'll get into it in a bit. First up, get yourself a drink, maybe a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. I'm a bit of an insane loon when it comes to coffee in this hot heat. This one my hubby made for me just now, so I'll be maybe drinking it throughout if I remember and not get too involved with talking to you guys. Let's talk about my progress on my projects. So on the Buyer's Bliss cowl, let me just hold it up the right direction. I think this is the right way. I have made quite a bit of progress. I love working on it. I just found that, I don't know, I can't tell you why, but when it comes to the color changing rows, I've picked up an aversion to doing them. I think it's maybe knowing that each color change row is going to cause an end to come out. So I think maybe sometime I should just take some time to sew in these ends and make it a little bit less stressful. But yeah, so I've picked up that when it comes to that row, I'm like, I don't want to work on this anymore. But I am loving how it's working up. I'm loving how the pattern is emerging. And yeah, this is really nice. Then I've also made quite a bit of progress on my Jethro. I have finished an entire front panel and I've started with the back panel. So you can see there's a little bit of a color change in comparison. Let me hold it up this way maybe. And that honestly is just the beauty of handmade yarn. So yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll work the top rows of the back panel and then 1, 2, 3 of the blocks that's interdispersed, just to like help with that color change, because the back panel unfortunately would need to be worked in more than one skein, because I can get exactly 8 blocks out of one skein. So yeah, but I'm really excited to work on this more. I must say, this yarn from Spindles and Spokes, it's called the Nonyana base, is very fast becoming one of my favorite bases. It has such a drape and a hand to it that's so lovely. I don't know if you guys can like feel the drape as I'm squishing it through the screen, but even though it's crochet, which traditionally is, I want to call it a crispy type of fabric, like unless it's linen stitch in a very thin yarn, crochet garments tend to feel stiff to me. This doesn't, not at all, not even a little bit. I am really impressed with this yarn base. It is phenomenal. I think it is a DK weight, but I am definitely going to be making more things in this. No doubt. It's lovely. I'm loving this. I'm loving the way that the colors are shifting. I'm loving everything about this yarn. It is my number one yarn if you were to ask me today this question. Cool. Now for the topic of today, what I want to talk about is yarn substitution and how to make decisions when you need to substitute yarn. Because patterns are not necessarily created by South African creators with access to South African yarns. So I think for us, it is a much more important conversation to have, because if you look at American designers or European designers, the yarns that they have access to is not the same as what we easily have access to. You can import by all means, but then it becomes pricey, and we do have phenomenal local merino, which honestly should not be discounted. But it can be difficult when you need to substitute something and all you have to go on is meterage. So I want to start this discussion off by showcasing my favorite tool in my toolbox, which is called a it's just an inch meter. It's a wraps per inch meter. I don't know whether it has a special name, but you measure your wraps per inch with it. So this little gappy is an inch big. You don't need a specific tool like this. You can also purchase a very cost-effective one from Wool and Floss. You don't have to import the one from Ashford. You don't have to spend a lot of money on this. If you have a ruler that has inch markings on it, like for example this one has centimeters on the one side, inches on the other. If it has inch markings, you can even use this, but you just need to be careful about where your yarn fall and be honest with yourself if it's over or under, because obviously you don't have an exact space like this to do your wraps in. So that said, what does this tell you? So wraps per inch gives you a very good measurement in terms of how the width of the yarn compares to the width of the yarn you're comparing to. Because if you're looking at, I wrote my little cheat sheet here long ago. If you're looking at bulky yarn, you're going to get 5 to 6 wraps per inch. If you're looking at double knitting, for example, you're going to have 11 wraps per inch, right? So if you're looking at a pattern that is asking for a bulky yarn and you're getting 11 wraps per inch out of the yarn you're intending to use, then you know that it's just over half amount of thinner, and you need to make the decision whether you want to make a smaller size or a bigger size with more stitches that's going to have a smaller result because you're working with a thinner yarn, or whether you want to go and look for a yarn that matches the wraps per inch better. I must say that's where Ravelry comes in really nicely, because for a lot of the American frequently available yarns, they do list the wraps per inch, which means that it is easier for us to compare wraps per inch than just going off meterage. So the reason why going off meterage is so difficult is because you have different ways of spinning yarn that have a different result. So if you spin yarn woolen, it means that you are capturing air within your yarn. So the end result is that you're going to get a lot more meterage for the same weight, just because your yarn is a lot more fluffier than what the next comparable worsted spun one is. So worsted spun is the alternative to woolen spun. Worsted spun is where they actually squish out the air that's in the fiber, so it makes a much more sturdier feeling yarn, but you get a little bit less meterage. But when it comes to wear, it's a lot more hard wearing. Some people will have a differing opinion on that. I think it depends on where on your body you put it. Something on your feet are going to not like woolen spun. So to that end, if you want to know a yarn that we can get locally that's different like this, the DK yarns that you can typically buy from indie dyers. So for example, I've got a lovely one from Black Cat here. So this type of yarn, you can see it is nice and smooth. There isn't any fluffies coming out of it. The thread itself is very well defined. So this is a worsted spun yarn. But if you're looking at something like Almerino, I love just sitting in front of my stash. So Almerino is actually woolen spun, which is why a lot of people think, oh, it's not a DK. It is a DK. It's not a worsted. So you can see that it looks a lot more fluffy, a lot more airy. And when you actually squish the strands, it feels like they're soft. If you feel like you can press them down. So what ends up happening with Almerino is as you're working with it and you're putting tension on it, you're squishing out a little bit of that air, which means that it behaves like a DK, even though when you look at the strand's thickness, it doesn't necessarily compare to a DK. If I hold them next to each other, you can see that the Almerino looks like it should be classified thicker than what this DK should be from Black Cat, but they're actually quite close to each other. This one's meterage is 216 meters per 100 grams, and this one is 200 meters per 100 grams. So 100 meters per 50 grams, because that's how you can buy the balls. So they're actually really close to each other. But yeah, So that's the big difference. That does play into your substitution when you're looking at your pattern as well, because if the original piece was worked up in a woolen yarn, you want to work your piece also in a woolen yarn, because you're going to get a similar meterage, similar thickness, similar hand. So the hand means how it drapes or how it moves on the body. Whereas if you substitute a woolen yarn with a worsted yarn, you're going to get a little bit of a more stiffer fabric, a little bit more of a body to it. You'll get more stitch definition, and that might be a creative choice you want to make. So if you want to, nothing's stopping you. There's no knitting police, like I like to say. So back to the wraps per inch meter. So the way that this guy works, this is a little bit of DK that I've dyed before. It's very similar base to the Black Cat one. So if we take it, let me just get the end here. There we go. If we get the end, what you do is that you have your little inchie, you pin it to your little board, and then you wrap it around. But you shouldn't be wrapping it and then squishing up your threads to be able to get more threads in. You should just be wrapping it with the one thread laying gently next to the next thread, gently next to the next thread, without crowding them and without leaving gaps between them. And then you just keep going round and around until your inch is full, almost there. There we go. So I don't know whether you guys can see, but there is still a very small little gappy there. I'm not going to try and fit in another thread in there, because then I'm going to crowd my threads and I'm going to get the wrong count. I can see there's a bit of gappies though. Let me wrap this again and then we can make sure to have an accurate count. I'm just going to wrap it closer to my face so I can see. Cool. There we go. That's a much better result. So you can see now they're close to each other, they're not crowding each other, and they're filling the space nicely. So now that we wrapped it, we can count how many wraps is there in the inch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 wraps. So now I know that is what this yarn's wraps per inch is. If I now want to compare it to the Al Merino, for example, I can do the same exercise with the Al Merino, where I take an end and I wrap it around. 13. Okay, so there's our Al Merino wraps. So now if I count these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I'm getting 13 and there's a small space. I'm going to count 13 and a half. So now if I compare that to the other DK that I just wrapped, where I got 16 wraps per inch. Now that means that this DK, the Al Merino, is going to be a little bit more floofier and a little bit thicker of a fabric, because its wraps per inch is less than what the other DK's was. With the other DK, it's a hand-dyed one that I got from Stucken. So that one, the fabric will be a little bit more drapey, a little bit looser when I create the same garment with the same gauge. So with other words, the same amount of stitches that fit into a 10 centimeter space. So let's say the gauge was 22. If I create something, both of them coming out to 22 stitches, the Al Merino is going to give me a bit of a more floofier, stiffer fabric, whereas the Stucken DK is going to give me a little bit of a more softer, drapey, airy fabric. So that's one thing to consider when it comes to substituting yarn, that you need to understand that. The other thing to consider is plies. So when you look at your yarns, you get different kinds of plies in yarn. So for example, this one is from Luna Fibers. It's just a mini. This one is a 400 meters per 100 grams 4-ply merino yarn. So in the plies in there, I hope it's going to focus. Oh, there we go. No. I'm trying to cover my face so it doesn't pick up my eyeballs. So in this yarn, you can see that it is a bit of a smoother looking yarn because it's got the 4 plies. So it's 4 very, very thin strands that's been spun together. So how you can know that it's 4 plies is if you untwist this like so, and then you count those thin little yarnies, you'll see that there's 4 of them. Now, I also have a sock yarn from Wool & Floss here. So this one is a 366 meters per 100 grams, so they should be quite comparable. But this one is a 3-ply. So if I untwist these yarnies and I count those little strands, there is 3 of them. Okay. So now the difference in plies impact your stitch definition more than anything else. So when you're working something like cables, you want a high ply in your yarn, so a 3-ply or a 4-ply, because the amount of plies make for a smoother yarn and a stronger stitch definition, which translates into your cables to show your cables better. If you were to do cable work with a single, for example, all of the fluffiness of a single is going to, over time, be eaten up by that cable. So then it's going to start looking like just a slightly textured fabric rather than showing off all of those cables that you've put so much hard work into. So if it's a cable pattern that's asking for a certain amount of plies in the yarn, that you need to then pay attention to rather find something that is closer to the ply amount than to the meterage, be a close match. So if you can find a 400 meter with a higher ply count, that might work a little bit better in your pattern if it has cables than something that is a 360 meter yarn but only a 2-ply, for example. 3-ply would also be good. So if I was to have the 3 options, I would maybe go for the 360 meters with a 3-ply rather than 360 meters with a 2-ply. Okay, we do get both of those options here in South Africa. Then it comes to fluffy yarns. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because the fluff creates what they call a halo. So you will sometimes see that the fluffy yarns like this one is a silk silk alpaca, no, silk mohair mix. So you'll sometimes see that this is referenced as a lace, and sometimes it's referenced as a DK. The reason for that is because the wraps per inch, or the thickness of the yarn, is measured without or with the halo. So if it's measured without, I'll try and get it to show nicely. You'll see within that halo, there is a thin strand that is really thin. And if we compare this now to our 400 meter fingering weight one, you can see very easily that that would be classified as a lace because it's so thin. But then you also see all of those fluffy bits. So the fluffy bits is what makes the difference between considering it a DK or considering it a lace. Because if you count the fluffy bits in your thickness of your yarn, then it becomes a DK. Okay, so that means when you actually look at your pattern and its requirements, you need to be very mindful whether it's asking for a lacy type of merino or a thicker type of mohair, because you do get a thicker type of mohair as well. How you can usually tell is the meterage. So this one is about 200 meters per 25 grams. And then the thicker type of one is usually about 120, maybe 80 meters per 50 grams. So you can tell that it goes a lot It's a lot less meterage for the thicker one, just because it's more fiber, right? So when you're holding your yarns together and you're substituting with local yarns, you need to substitute your mohair with the correct type of mohair, whether it's this thin type or the thicker type. I unfortunately don't have an example of the thicker type, because the thicker type gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't know why. Michelle calls it tactile defensive. So yeah. So now when you're holding your yarns together with a mohair, it is being considered differently than if you are working with the yarn just so. And that one, it's really difficult to tell whether the substitution is going to work. So then I would rather pay attention to the alternative yarn you're holding together. So whether that yarn is a fingering or a DK weight or whatever it is, and then determining the mohair held with it separately. Okay. If you want to replace a pattern that's asking for yarn to be held together, if you don't want a fluffy project, but you love the design and you want to still make it, you can consider what they determine the two together to be, the weight. So in Ravelry, again, fantastic. You'll see in the top part of the pattern, they will say a lace plus a fingering equals a DK, right? Or something like that, for what they determine the final yarn output to be. So then if you want to replace with just a smooth yarn, nothing held with it, then you need to find a DK weight yarn that will suit. So with these fluffy type of patterns, when you're replacing with just a smooth yarn, I do recommend to go thicker rather than thinner. So if it's asking for a DK, look for a woolen spun DK like the El Merino, or a thicker kind of DK rather than a thinner kind of DK. So then the Nonyona is also a very good option. Because you want that weight to then carry the design, because it was originally designed with fluffiness in mind. So it needs that poofiness. So your new thinner yarn, smooth yarn replacement need to embody that poofiness to get the same looking design elements. But again, it is up to you to decide whether those are the elements you want to emulate, or whether you would be okay with just going with the flow and seeing what happens, because that is also perfectly fine. Okay, that's fluffy yarns. The last thing I want to discuss when it comes to yarn substitution is swatching. Swatching is imperative if you want to make a yarn substitution. So very often I've made a pattern before where it would ask for a fingering weight yarn, right? Or it would ask for a 300 meter weight yarn per 100 grams. And then when I do the swatch with yarn that's fairly close to it, it doesn't quite match to my expectations. And very often I've ended up not actually making the pattern just because the swatch was telling me I'm not going to enjoy the fabric that comes out of it. So I know swatching is a very contentious topic, and a lot of the time it feels like a chore. But that 10 centimeter blocky, that doesn't have to be 10 centimeters high. It can be 5 or like 4 centimeters high, however much you need for it to tell you what you need to know from it. That little blocky is going to save you an entire project's worth of pain and suffering by doing it, because your swatch is going to tell you what sort of fabric you're going to get out of the yarn that you're trying to substitute into this pattern, whether it's going to hold the cables nicely, whether it's going to show the lace nicely, whether it's going to have the drape that you like. And then depending on the outcome of that swatch, you can make educated adjustments. So if the swatch gets the right stitch count, everything is fine, but you don't like the drape, it's too stiff, then try and use a bigger needle and then adjusting your stitch counts to be a bit lower. So maybe make a smaller size, a one size smaller, to get a little bit of a more drapey fabric. If the swatch is a little bit more too drapey to your liking and you want more stiffness, then use smaller needles to get that stiffness, to get that structure into your fabric. Or consider adding a merino, a mohair little floofy to create that slight extra bulk that might make the difference for you. If the pattern maybe calls for a fingering and a mohair being held together and the fabric is still too floppy for you, try adding another mohair. Like, there's so many changes that you can make that you can adjust from just knowing what the swatch is doing. And then you don't have to make the entire garment to answer that question. You can just do the swatch. It answers it for you. The last thing, though, is a very big heartache for me. In South Africa, we don't really get what they call a sport weight yarn. So that is the yarns that falls in about 300 meters per 100 grams. The sport weights we get here behave more like fingering yarn than like sport weight yarns. And then there's also some that is in the 300 meters per 100 gram range, but it's actually behaving like a DK and not like a sport. So that is like the Rios from Malabrigo. So this one is 300 meters per 100 grams, but it's a DK, it's not a sport. So that is a difficult thing to get right here. I haven't really found a reliable sport weight. If you have found one maybe that works fantastic as a sports substitution, please let me know, because this far, every time I've come across a pattern asking for a sport weight substitution, I've just been fudging the numbers and making it up as I go along to make the sizing work out. So yeah, I would be interested to know if you maybe know of one that I haven't come across yet. I haven't really paid attention to like the Rowan and the John Arbons of the world that you can get, or even the Katjas I haven't really looked at. I've mostly been using Indie Dye Merino or Malabrigo. So that might just be an experience issue, to be quite frank. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you learned something, what you think. I really enjoyed having this chat with you guys, and I hope that it is useful. So yeah, I'll catch you in the next video. Have fun. Bye.